The worlds of Eras and Strangereal get a lot of attention these days, and rightfully so. They're the main roleplay worlds of the North Pacific, and are often featured in Roleplay Reel articles. Easily forgotten, however, are the other roleplay worlds that don't fall within the boundaries we're so familiar with. This podcast takes a closer look at one such roleplay, the Inaius Starfall Roleplay, hosted by Prydania. Welcome to the show, Prydania.
Hey, happy to be here. Happy to talk about Inaius and happy to talk about Starfall.
Yeah, so what I'm aiming for with this podcast is to just give newcomers to the roleplay a bit of a portrait into that world. And in order to do so, I'm starting off with asking some general questions. Then I'm going to dive into some sort of like background lore, and then get into specific questions to this particular roleplay and some of the posts that have already been made, before wrapping things up with some final questions and advice.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, within that aside, let's dive right in. Could you tell us a bit about what sets this roleplay apart from the story arcs that are in Eras and the Strangereal worlds, and sort of what makes this world different?
Well, Inaius kind of came about from a collection of our peers in Eras, actually. It was primarily birthed from a bunch of Eras RPers who had an interest in sci-fi and had an interest in future tech and space. Eras isn't really the best place to explore those because in Eras we have a tech limit that you can have futuristic tech, but it can only be, roughly 5 to 10 years more advanced than what we have on Earth. And so it's kind of like an immediate future setting. But we had a lot of people who wanted to do space-themed RP, who wanted to do sci-fi themed stuff. And credit to Andy, actually, who was the big one to get it going. I don't believe he was the original Inaius mod, but he very much took it over and promoted it and made it what it is. And so what Inaius is basically what I said. It's space RP. I believe that in terms of broad lore, it's on the other end of the Milky Way galaxy. It takes place at some indeterminate point in the future, and you carve out a little bit of space and you claim it as your space empire or your space nation, and you get to work. I'd say that what really differentiates it from Eras, or Strangereal for that matter, is that in Inaius, there's so much variety. We've got not just humans, but we have variety of alien races as well. And that kind of creates new storytelling opportunities because Eras is almost entirely human. Strangereal is mostly human.
With some little lotion bottles thrown in.
Yeah, with some lotion bottles or cat girls thrown in. But Inaius is pretty much anything that you can think of from a sci-fi perspective.
That's pretty much what I noticed.
Yeah, it's really fun. The shackles really come off, and that's why I kind of enjoy it so much, and why I'm really kind of excited to talk about it in particular, because there are a lot of ideas here that I'm able to play with that I couldn't in Eras, so...
Yeah, when I saw you post in the Inaius roleplay this afternoon, it was actually the first time I'd seen it. And I mean, that might sound strange given how many posts there's been and how many threads there's been now that I've gone back and looked, but this was the first time I'd seen it at all. And so I sort of, became interested and became curious. So you mentioned that there was a technological limit in the Eras universe. And when we start talking about future tech, a lot of times people start thinking that the technology level is infinite, to say the least. Is there still a technology limit in the Inaius roleplay, and how is that defined in a future tech setting?
That actually speaks to another differentiating factor when it comes to Inaius, and that is that in both Strangereal and Eras, these are established communities that have been around for a few years. Strangereal's been around for 2 years. Eras has been around for, I think, 3 to 4 years. And as such, a lot of the rules have been hammered out. In Inaius, honestly, it's kind of crazy. I wish I could tell you that we had some really sensible limits on that, but I mean, we've got a nation or a star empire in Inaius, and the RPer behind it, he says they've got a Death Star. And we haven't outright told him no yet. So It's very much a free-for-all, and I kind of chalk that up to Inaius being younger than some of the other RP communities in TNP. It's still very much people figuring out what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. I would say broadly, we are currently not trying to stick to a hard sci-fi thing. It's more soft science fiction, soft future tech. If you can think of a technology and you can think of a good way to use it in a story, then by all means, broadly, you have that freedom.
When you say hard sci-fi versus soft sci-fi, do you mean that hard sci-fi is one that looks more deeply into the ideas and the technologies, and soft sci-fi is more about storytelling and character development, or have I completely misinterpreted that?
No, that's pretty much it. I would say it's not quite so pigeonholed. I think, for example, Star Trek, right, is a show that at least traditionally has sold itself as hard sci-fi, and they make a big deal about grounding a lot of their science fiction in at least theoretical science, as we know. But even classic Star Trek has very good character work and that kind of stuff. So I don't think they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but I would say, yeah, the divide you pointed out is broadly what I'm getting at. In Inaius, it's sort of like, if you can think of a technology, a piece of future technology, and you can tell a good story with it, then no one's really gonna give you a hard time over it. Whereas, in a more strict hard sci-fi setting, perhaps people would ask you to look a bit deeper at the technology and make sure that it is at least theoretically viable. That doesn't exist so much in Inaius, but what's really cool about Inaius is that if you wanted to do that with your own space nation or species or alien species, and you wanted to take a hard sci-fi approach within the Inaius universe, you could do that. It's very open.
That makes sense. All right, so when it comes to this particular Inaius roleplay, this thread in it, the Starfall thread, I've noticed that there's a lot of other threads out there going back maybe 2 years. I don't want to get the dates wrong, but that seemed to be about the time frame. Do you have to understand and have read that pre-existing lore to understand the events in this Starfall roleplay?
No, you don't. Not really. The only thing I would say currently that you would really need to read is maybe The Axes of Groll by St. George, aka Mad Jack, which was posted in March of 2018. Again, though, a lot of Inaius, like I said, is still pretty young compared to a lot of other stuff. And so most of the posts, not everything, there are a few RP posts, but most of the Inaius stuff currently out there is focused on world building. It's race profiles, species profiles that aren't necessarily stories, but it's just like, this is this alien race, this is what their deal is.
Sure.
That kind of thing. Starfall is mostly self-contained to two species. It's the Cowlor, who are the alien species that I came up with, and then there's the RM humans play a part in it. And the RM humans are basically just humans from the who settled on the planet RM, who kind of ran afoul of the Cowlor, and so they play a role in that as well. The only other race so far that plays a significant role is the Groll, played by Mad Jack. So I'd say that maybe if you want to get a good idea of what the Groll's deal is, you should read Axes of Groll. But other than that, you should be able to jump in and not have to worry too much about the lore.
All right, and when you say you can jump in, can anyone join? Is this sort of open to everyone who's interested in role-playing in this sort of universe?
Well, Inaius takes place in the non-Eras section of the Forum RP. And so we follow Eras conventions when it comes to marking threads. I have actually marked Starfall as open, meaning you don't have to message me, you don't have to get my permission, you don't have to ask me to collaborate on anything. If you are reading the thread and you want to get involved with your alien species or your space empire or what have you, you can dive right in.
I saw that open tag, and that's actually part of the reason why I chose this roleplay to focus on for this NBS broadcast. It was primarily because I thought you know what, hold on, it's open. Maybe there's a chance people can get involved. I just want to
Oh,
clarify,
yeah.
though, there isn't like some sort of application process or anything. You can just write a post and join in right away, right?
Yeah. Broadly, there is, and I want to stress that this isn't a rule by any stretch of the imagination. A lot of people, when it comes to RP, be it on the forums or RMB, tend to like to get on the appropriate map first before RPing. And so usually when people show up on the TMP RP server on Discord, we kind of tell them the first step is, get a map claim, because I think psychologically people feel like they can't do anything until they're on the map, which has never actually been a rule. Like you can start RPing and then get on the map after the fact. So the only thing close to an application is eventually you might want to get on the Inaius map, just so we all have a general idea of where things are happening. But beyond that, no, there's no application. There are a number of tags that we tag forum RP posts in. Usually closed or semi-closed will mean, if you want to get involved, you've got to talk to the original poster and either fill out some application or at least talk to them to figure out what you're doing. But on Starfall, it is completely open. I have a very broad idea where I want the story to go, but anyone who is interested in it, anyone who has an idea about how they'd like to contribute is free to post without consulting me in any way.
So let's just say that a new player has gone through the traditional process and they've now got their nation on the map. How much are new players expected to world build that nation and, provide a background story for the history of whatever species they're going to have? And I'm not saying as a rule, but sort of as a rule of thumb in order to create a well-balanced and well-thought-out roleplay post.
I would say that in contrast to just jumping into Starfall, I think in broadly in terms of Inaius in general, it would help just to look at a few of these species profiles. And these threads are all marked, by the way. If you go to the non-Eras section under RP on the forum, you'll see a number of stuff. We've got Acheron, Fel, and Inaius. Those are our 3 non-Eras forum RP worlds. So just look for the threads marked Inaius, and most of them should actually be species profiles at this point. It's not anything that you have to copy, but just take a look at what people are writing there and kind of get a feel of what sort of world building you're going to want to build up. The big thing I would say in terms of Inaius is that step 1's going to be dependent on what you want to do. Do you want to do a human-based empire or an alien-based one? If it's going to be human, you're going to want to figure out, how your sect of humans got to this part of space, what their culture's like. In that kind of way, it's a lot like Eras or Strangereal world building, because you're creating basically a human nation just set in space instead of on a planet-based map. So that's what you would do if you're going human. If you're
just
going
a quick follow-up question before you move on to the alien side. When you said, how they got there into that sector of space, would that be sort of the assumption that they started on Earth or something on the other side of the galaxy and they've sort of worked their way over? Like, how would you do that?
Yeah, so there was a bit of confusion as to what Inaius actually was when we started it. As I said at the start of this, Inaius was created by Eras RPers at first. We've actually gotten a few Strangereal RPers who have been interested in it and who have joined. But originally, it was a bunch of Eras people. And we, at first, were like, is this in like the same universe as Eras? Is the planet Eras floating around somewhere out there? And we decided, no, it's not.
You just answered a follow-up question I had from before as well. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's not. Eras does not exist in Inaius. Inaius is very much, we've settled on it, it is on the opposite end of the Milky Way galaxy, so Earth, as we know it, Earth exists. At some point in the future, Earth has been rendered completely uninhabitable, humans have taken to the stars, and so Inaius has pockets of human civilization kind of scattered throughout it. And so if you wanted to do a human-based space state or space empire in Inaius, You just figure out when humanity, when your sect of humans got there, how they got there. And then once you've really established that, then maybe start talking to some other people who RP as humans to see if you can world build some common history. But the great thing about how we set that up is that there wasn't just one great exodus of humanity. Humanity kind of left Earth in waves. So you don't even necessarily need to familiarize yourself with the other human entities on the Inaius map. You can just say, my people came here, on their own, and that should fit within the broad lore of Inaius.
Sure. And then to continue from before, how would you do the same thing if you were doing an alien race?
The thing with aliens is that there's really no rule on how you world build them. I would just say, from my own experience, think about how an alien creature evolves. We act the way we do as humans for a variety of reasons that you can trace back to how our ancestors evolved on the planet Earth, in the environments that they evolved in, and how they reacted to those stimuli. Everything about human behavior is ingrained behavior that developed as a reaction to something else. So when you're developing an alien species, don't just make them humans by any other name. Try to conceptualize what this race would be like if it really did gain sentience. An example of that is the race that I primarily RP in Inaius, the Cowlor. For you dinosaur fans out there, the Cowlor evolved from a Deinonychus-esque creature on their homeworld. So, essentially raptors, if you're not a dinosaur nerd and don't recognize that name. And so I'm trying to think, when I RP their culture, when I RP their society, when I RP how they interact with each other, I'm trying to think they're not necessarily going to act human. They are going to have certain ingrained qualities that's related to their evolution that's going to make them distinct from humans. Now, to be sure, we are all actual human beings writing these stories, and so a degree of humanization, whether it's subconscious or conscious, is inevitable, but it is always nice to kind of think on this stuff and think of ways in which they would evolve differently and look at themselves differently than how humans look at themselves. They would interact with others differently than the way humans interact with others. Just kind of keep that in mind. Keep in mind what you want the basis of your alien race to be, and then build it out from there.
That's great advice. All right, so at this point, I'm going to transition away from the overall Inaius versus Strangereal versus Eras questions that I have, and focus a little bit more in on this particular roleplay and how it sits inside of Inaius. So to that end and I'm just going to, from here on out, refer to it as the Starfall Roleplay. Is the Starfall Roleplay a continuation of past events, or does it sit within its own story arc within the Inaius universe?
It sits within its own story arc. Like I said earlier, you can dive right in, and the only thing you'd maybe need to read is Axis of Groll by MJ, just to get an idea of where the Groll come from. But other than that, it is not dependent on anything else related to Inaius. It's kind of my own thing that I had wanted to do. I'd actually say, based off of anything I've written in RP, Starfall is probably the one with the oldest roots. I've wanted to write about the Cowlor and and all of that stuff since I was a little kid. It was something that I've always kind of had floating in my head as a cool idea, and this is kind of me finally finding a setting where I can kind of put that pen to paper almost and flesh it out. And so it doesn't really have any connection to anything else. There is backstory that informs the present day events, but all of that I cover in it. I cover in the actual RP. So you shouldn't have to do much reading to get what's going on.
Got it. Even though you don't have to do the reading and you don't have to read the existing lore, could you, and I know this is a tough question to ask given how much of it there probably is, could you do your best to summarize some of the major events that have happened in other Inaius roleplays, and furthermore, talk a little bit about that one roleplay that you keep referencing that Mad Jack did with the Grolls?
So, okay. So the Groll are Mad Jack's kind of Inaius race. And they're great. They're basically blue space dwarves. And the great thing about them is that they don't have a concept of name. So they are all the Groll. And everyone is Groll. And everyone is Groll of Groll. And it's hilarious because if you ask MJ, and I dare anyone listening to this to actually do that, ask MJ about the Groll and ask him, like, how do they get along without names? And he will just flat out tell you, he'll flat out ask you what are names. And so that's kind of like a base thing for the Groll. They are, broadly speaking, an honor-bound warrior race. As I said, they really don't do the name thing. Everyone is Groll of Groll. And what's really hilarious about it is if you actually read the RP, you can still tell who is who by the way that he writes it. And if you pay attention, there are certain characters who have titles like Provost Master Groll or Provost Groll, and so you can keep track of it that way. So the Groll are basically as I said, they're I don't want to say barbarian, that has negative connotations, but they are a warrior space dwarf race. Probably the most fleshed out in Inaius in terms of actual posted content that's not just world building. Like in terms of actual story content, I think MJ probably has everyone beat on that. We've got, I'd say the next biggest thing is probably the Leviathan. The Leviathan is a lab experiment from the Yaviri Syndicate. The Yaviri Syndicate is controlled by Andy, or Andrin. They're sort of his alien race. They are very much kind of these... I want to make sure I get this right. I believe they are four-armed. No, they're 4 or 6 arms. I can't remember, but they are multi-armed, kind of these hulking alien guys, but they have a very advanced society called the Syndicate. They had a lab experiment called the Leviathan, which went horribly wrong. The Leviathan is basically a biomass of plant material that's consuming its way through space, and it's got plant people who sort of serve it.
That's great.
Yeah, the Leviathan is controlled by Yuki. And so I'd say probably outside of the Groll just sort of asserting themselves, the biggest thing would probably be the Syndicate trying to deal with the Leviathan. Leviathan is kind of in a gray area right now. Yuki kind of wants to move their location on the map, so that would probably cause some minor retcons, but I don't imagine it would be too terrible. But yeah, the Syndicate versus the Leviathan is kind of an ongoing thing. You've also got the Cartographers, which is another thing that Yuki is behind. Yuki's really kind of thrown himself into Inaius. The Cartographers are a race. They're actually not even a race or a single species. They're a collection of species that have decided that they want to preserve knowledge. And so they're kind of doing the whole, we will preserve all the knowledge we come across kind of deal. They're not really interested in conquest so much as they are kind of recording the events of their time.
That sounds like the Foundation series, from Isaac Asimov.
That was my thought too, honestly. I haven't asked Yuki about his inspiration, but if I had to guess, that would probably be one of his major sources of inspiration on that one. We've actually had an influx of activity in Inaius. We've got Tim, who is behind Esselania in Eras. He started it's a race of fish people, essentially.
In space.
In space. But what's brilliant about it is that it happened almost as a lark over voice chat that, to his credit, he took with utter sincerity and ran with it. You got, like, sharks at the top, you got fish people who are servants, and then you've got, like, a squid, like, priestly caste, I believe. It's fascinating. It's actually really great. Like I said, I'll start it off as sort of a voice chat lark that Tim took and really poured his heart into, and it's pretty fascinating. And I'd say that they're actually unique, that this race of fish people, because they aren't interested in conquest. Tim is kind of always talking about how they want to experience first contact and how that's going to go. And so a lot of Inaius is very conflict-oriented, but the fish people aren't really. They just want to get along with everyone. But outside of that, we've got Espelandia's Asteron people, the Tyranids, which is sort of a collection of different species that have banded together under one banner. I believe they all came from the same planet, but they're like multiple intelligent species that are under one banner. And we just got Keoki from Strangereal. They've created the Chosulk Collective, cooperative, and they're basically space bug people from an ice world. So I'd say those are broadly the big players currently.
When you said diversity of species earlier, I didn't really understand what you meant. Now I think I'm starting to get it.
Yeah.
I mean, wow, that is a lot of creativity. See, the thing is that last term when we were doing these NBS recordings, we had a lot of broader roleplay-related questions, and I think going forward, I'm going to want to, get a real framework going on, interviewing specific people about their roleplay nation, and in Inaius or Strangereal or Eras, any of the worlds that we have operating, or even Thal, as I noticed as well, take a deeper dive.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot of stuff that hasn't really been talked about. A lot of stuff that's flown under the radar. And I think a lot of it's quite interesting. I still need to commit more time to Acheron, as an example, which is a RP world that's set on our Earth, but post-apocalypse. And Esp runs that. And it's really fascinating, and I really want to commit more time to it, but I just can never really find the time to do it. So, but yeah, Inaius. So to answer your question about kind of like the major events of Inaius, right now that's kind of it. There is a deluge of ideas that people are just sort of starting to coalesce into actual RP. It was very world building heavy, and now we're starting to get RP heavy, which is very exciting.
That sounds awesome. So at this point, as I mentioned to you before, I've only read the first few posts of the Starfall Roleplay. And so while I would love to get into a lot of the detail of, the Grolls and other species and how they have, taken part in Inaius, at this point, I really only have experience reading the first few posts of the Kalor and Aram. And with that, I actually want to take a little bit more of a story-specific dive into the Kalor and speak about that species with you.
Oh, you have no idea how happy you made me.
Well, let's dive right into it then. So I have read a little bit, but could you give us a bit of the background and the history of the Kalor and what their current government is and sort of what brought us to this point? As I was reading, there was, an empress and a council of governors, and I don't really understand what's going on. Could you sort of get into that detail?
All right. So, like I said earlier, the Kalor are an idea I've had since I was a little kid. Basically, space raptors seemed fun, and I've kind of been playing with that as an idea for a while. And basically, when I decided to do this in Inaius, I had an idea, which was, I hate how in science fiction, alien races are basically stand-ins for nation-states. The go-to example in Star Trek is the Klingon Empire. Every Klingon adheres to the same cultural norms, which doesn't make any sense because the Klingons aren't a nation-state, they're an entire species. You look at humanity, right? If we ever went to the stars, would we all coalesce into one culture, or would we, keep our own cultural and ethnic distinctiveness? I think the latter is more likely. So I didn't want there to be one Kalor culture. The Kalor basically, as I said, are evolved from a Deinonychus or, Velociraptor-like species on their planet, and they have one unitary government, but it is called the Imperial Confederation for a reason. Basically, the ethnic and cultural distinctiveness that you would expect from a species that gained sentience and then was advanced enough to develop interstellar travel exists. there are multiple Calorian nations, multiple Calorian ethnicities, and essentially what happened was they had a war that they basically had their equivalent of World War III, where they kind of blew themselves up to hell. And the strongest superpower left standing was the Tigardii Empire. And they kind of helped put everything back together, and the general deal that was struck was all of these individual and distinctive nations of Calorians would agree to submit to the imperial throne, but in turn, the government allowed them a greater degree of autonomy. So you have an empress currently, but underneath the empress, there are all of these nations. Like, the planet of Calor is technically unified, but it is in actuality divided between any number of nation states and ethnicities. And just like you would have the case on Earth, these ethnicities don't necessarily get along. There's a lot of old prejudices and a lot of old animosities that most people have moved on from, but, there's always that lingering bit of animosity that exists in those situations. So their government is very decentralized. Broadly speaking, each Calorian nation on Calor and each colony can run its own affairs so long as they pay their taxes and don't actively rebel against the Empire. And the military is sort of the strong unifying factor that keeps everyone on the same page, which is where most of the focus is on the RP. It's on the Calorian military.
So there were two things that I noticed when I was reading your history that struck me. The first one was that deal that was struck between Tigard and not just all the independent nations to make, one confederation, but I think there was a post where you were explaining that there was another faction that was almost as strong as Tigard that was religious in nature, and
Yes.
They basically struck a deal that allowed one to recognize the authority of the other. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that's the Golden Talon, which was a theocracy on Calor before it was unified. The Golden Talon is quite interesting. The best way I can describe it is kind of a theocratic monarchy where it's got a priest king, and broadly speaking, it's kind of difficult to get into. But basically, to use human parallels, if the Tigardii are the West, then imagine the Golden Talon as, I guess, sort of the Middle East, in a way, is a good way to put it. And so they were basically these two centers of power on pre-unified Calor. And there were, of course, other nation states and ethnic groups that sort of gravitated towards one or the other. That when the planet got blown to hell, these two groups were essentially the last two standing. And rather than fight it out to the point where everyone was dead, the Tigardii were like, we'll send our troops to help rebuild your, civilization. You recognize our imperial authority, and we'll recognize your spiritual authority. And the thing is that the Golden Talon and the Tigardii, there is not much religious overlap in actuality, but the point that I wanted to make with that post was to set the stage that Calor is a pluralistic world. There are multiple religions, there are multiple ethnicities, there are multiple nations. They're all Calorians. And to us, as, humans, if we were to see them, we would probably say that, they are all broadly alike. But to them, the differences are still stark. Much how I believe that if aliens ever saw humans in our current state, they'd be like, why do you have all this racial division? You're all just various shades of pink and brown. That's sort of the idea I was getting at.
Yeah. The second thing that struck me was in the story of the Aram. So correct me if I'm wrong, but there was sort of this understanding that I built up when I was reading your posts that historically, pre-unification, there were a lot of colony ships and whatnot that were sent out after the development of faster-than-light travel. And so these colony ships then went and, built colonies on other planets or in other star systems. And then once unification occurred on Kalor, then and only then did they sort of get worked into this confederation, whether by choice or by force. And my question was, first off, is that a correct interpretation of what happened? And secondly, is RM one of those that was taken by force, or was it one that later rebelled against that confederation?
Okay, well, to your first question, yeah, that's more or less it. Kalor unified itself, and then the military kind of spread outward to bring the colonies into the fold. Some went peacefully, some resisted. Now, here's the thing. The RM actually aren't The RM aren't Kalorians. The RM are actually humans.
I was going to get to that, yeah.
Yeah, the RM are actually humans. So, like I said, humans exist in Inaius. There are multiple groupings of humans. There are humans scattered throughout the setting. And the RM, traditionally, they had nothing to do with the Kalorian colony ships. It was basically a human colony world that, at least in my mind, actually predates Kalorian faster-than-light travel. So that is to say that humans showed up and colonized RM before the Kalorians even took to the stars. And then the Kalorians took to the stars and ran into them. And for a while, there was it wasn't necessarily always hostile. You had these various Kalorian colonies that were founded by, these various separate corporations or nations on Kalor, and they would trade with the RM as they needed to. When the Kalorians unified their race under the Imperial Confederation and they kind of came up against the RM, that's when things started to go wrong for them. Because if you think about what the Kalorian Imperial Confederation is, it's trying to hold an entire race of multiple religions and ethnicities together. You just have to look at Earth to realize kind of how daunting a task that would be. So I was thinking, how would the Kalorians manage that? And I thought, well, they're descended from a raptor-like species. Raptors, very territorial creatures. So I came up with the idea that in an effort to sort of smooth over their own cultural distinctiveness, to sort of deal with the fact that they have all of these different nations and whatnot within themselves, they'd say, okay, none of that matters as much as the fact that we're all Kalorians and we are great and we deserve to have anything that we want. And here are these ape people on this planet near our border, and we're going to basically take it because we deserve it. And so that's kind of how the RM kind of get roped into the Kalorian manifest destiny, for lack of a better term.
Understood, yeah. Okay, so in the opening post of the Starfall Roleplay, Star Marshal Tios Demox, pardon my horrible pronunciation, has a special meeting with the Empress. Yes. I had a little bit of difficulty understanding some of the exchange between them, not because of the mystery and the mystique surrounding the situation. I know you want to keep that secret for the benefit of the roleplay, but I wanted to know what is the role of a Star Marshal? What sort of work was Tios expected to do without giving away too many of the details that we'll find out later?
So Star Marshal is basically, he's the head of the military, the space-spanning military of the Kalorians. He's the head guy in charge. And to tie kind of into the RM, basically what happened, the RM humans and the Imperial Confederation of Kalor had a border dispute that blew up into a war. But the war was basically a series of border skirmishes. At this time, Tios, he was a captain of a Kalorian ship, and what ended up happening was this war that was, again, a series of border skirmishes suddenly kind of escalated when a RM raiding party basically managed a surprise attack on a city on Kalor's moon. And that was seen as a huge embarrassment because the enemy was able to basically strike at the heart of Kalorian space, and it was this huge embarrassment that the military brass had allowed that to happen. So Teos stages a coup of sorts, basically slaughters the general staff, and with the Empress's blessing, becomes the new Star Marshal. He's in charge of the military. And what I wanted to set up is, it's been some years since then. He then kind of renewed the war with RM with very enthusiastic vigor. He destroyed the planet by bombing it from orbit for weeks and killed or enslaved as many RM humans as he could get his hands on, or claws on, because he's a raptor. But specifically, where we start off on Starfall is he's been called to Tigard to meet with the Empress, and she wants him to kind of update her on this project that he's been working on. It's been a few years now. Teos Demachus is entrenched as the Star Marshal of Kalor. He has successfully waged a war against the RM humans and defeated them utterly. As such, he's a big war hero. He's very popular amongst the rank-and-file soldiers in the military. And what has he been spending his time on since then?
Is the question that this whole roleplay seems to unfold around.
Yes, he is essentially...
Don't give it away!
Okay, I'm not going to give too much away. But basically, he's looking for relics.
And a coin?
Yes.
Don't tell us why.
No, I'm not gonna spoil anything, but he's looking for essentially relics from a hyper-advanced species that is long since dead, and there are basically legends of this great war that happened millennia ago, and these great weapons from that war were said to be scattered. You know, there are myths all over the place. You don't necessarily put stock in them, but the best way I could describe it is, you know that scene in Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark where the Nazis open the Ark and it melts their faces off?
Shockingly, I do know that scene. Like, it's one of the few.
So, imagine if you are a higher up in the US military and you get an intelligence report on your desk that is undeniable proof that not only does the Ark of the Covenant exist, but it does the thing from the movie, right? And that this power could be harnessed. So it's like, yeah, you would be like, who do we need to send where to get it? And so that's kind of what's going on. There are these relics from this long-lost civilization that Teos has been informed of from fairly reliable sources that they not only existed, but they are very powerful weapons in their own right, and he wants to track them down. And he knows specifically which weapon he wants to track down, and he knows that he wants to reverse engineer it and use its power source to power his own version of that weapon, which is basically, imagine an energy weapon that could shear the atmosphere off of a planet. That's what he's looking for. And he also wants to reverse engineer it. And so that's what he's been spending his time on since the end of the War of the RM. And he's being called in to speak to the Empress to basically say, this is what's going on.
All right, so I did want to get a little bit back to the RM before we sort of dived into that. One thing that I noticed from what you said before was that the RM sort of lashed out and attacked a Kalorian city, right?
A city on their moon. They basically attacked the first off-world colony of in Kalorian history. So.
Okay, so while the actions of Teos when he decimated RM and conquered that world, would you say that the RM preemptively struck Kalor, and would the ultimate blame sort of be on them?
To a degree, yeah. And this kind of gets into my thoughts, kind of going back to what I said earlier about building an alien race and kind of almost looking to how humans evolved as sort of a template for how you would think of how an alien race would evolve. And you think about humans and all of the negative things you could say about our species. And every negative thing you can say about us, you know, we tend to be xenophobic or territorial or protective or aggressive. Why are we that way? We are that way because despite the fact that we don't have exoskeletons or claws or thick fur we're not even particularly strong or fast. We emerged as the dominant species on this planet because we were the most vicious, territorial sons of bitches out there, and we just killed our way to the top. And when creating an alien race, you don't want to make them carbon copies of humans. At the same time, you kind of have to take into account that if they're going to become the dominant species on their world, and they're going to then take to the stars, they would likely have gone through a similar evolutionary ringer. And so, because of that, the RM, who are humans, and the Colorians, we're both talking about two races that emerged as the dominant life forms on their respective homeworlds. And because of that, they're both incredibly territorial. They're both going to be incredibly xenophobic. They're not going to trust the quote-unquote other. They're not going to, be particularly happy to share resources if there's a chance that they can take them all for themselves. And so it's really a case of two alpha dogs fighting it out because, RM isn't Earth, but, the RM, the humans who settle on RM, it's more or less their homeworld. And they, of course, are descended from humans who, evolved on Earth. And the Colorians are a vicious species that evolved and dominated their own world on their own. So it's two races that are not particularly going to be inclined to get along, especially when you consider, from an evolutionary standpoint, humans are mammals. Colorians, being descended from a raptor-like species, would be avians or reptiles or somewhere in between. These are two groups of animals that have traditionally in nature competed against each other for resources and have an ingrained almost dislike of the other. So humans from RM and the Colorians, they were almost destined to not like each other, and they were destined to clash with each other when push came to shove. And yeah, the RM certainly provoked the Colorians. Absolutely they did. They kind of brought their own genocide or enslavement on themselves in a way because they acted like an apex predator would, and they poked another apex predator, and the other apex predator happened to be more vicious, and that's what happened. At the same time, I wouldn't necessarily say the Colorians are good or innocent either. I mean, at the end of the day, the Colorians are expansionist. They tend to think very highly of themselves and very little for any other race. Very xenophobic, very vicious, very militaristic. So so even though I would say that the RM definitely were at fault and provoked the Colorians, at the same time, the Colorians are not particularly heroes either.
The reason why I've been interested in the RM so much is because in your second post you introduce Callum, an imprisoned RM soldier, now slave, who's being asked to repair the engines of what I can only assume is some desperate ship. And so what I wanted to ask next was, I couldn't help but wonder at the choice of name. Callum, as you probably know, represents peace or purity, and I was wondering if anything can sort of be read into his background, even though he's spent much of his life as a soldier.
Definitely, yes. I admit, even though I have no real prospects or desire to have a family, I have a bunch of baby name sites bookmarked for RP purposes because it's great to peruse and figure out the meanings behind names. And that goes into a lot, not every character I name, but a lot of them. And with Callum, he is a guy who became a soldier because he felt it was his duty to become a soldier, but truth be told, his natural inclination would be, if all things being equal, he would have loved to have just stayed a farmer on RM and not have gotten involved in the military whatsoever, but he kind of got dragged into it. He wants peace, and not to give too much away from what happens later on, but there is a point where he is offered the chance to do something about his current situation, and his greatest aspiration at this point in his life, now that RM's been completely razed and most of the RM are either slaves or refugees, his greatest ambition is to find a refugee camp in Grohl space and just try to make a living somewhere. He is so over being a soldier at this point.
I'm really glad I picked up on that, because I don't think most people would.
Like I said, I've got these sites full of names and what they mean, and I like to put them to you.
All right, so to transition back to sort of what we were getting into, I don't want to get too much into detail about the project, and I feel like you've already gone too much into detail about what the relics are. But is there any sort of backstory on what Ansif or the Kozol are when you mention them in the conversation between the Empress and the Star Marshal? And I'm just wondering, like, is there some sort of background or plot elements that newcomers who are going to join in on this roleplay should already know that isn't explained?
All right, so the Ansif are the race that created these relics that Teos is looking for. So they're millennia ago, they were a super advanced race that occupied broadly the space that all of this RP takes place in, and their own civilization brought itself down to nothing via a destructive civil war that ended up destroying themselves. And these relics that Teos is looking for are the remnants of that war. And I guess the best way you could think of it, the Ansif are basically, and I'll just flat out say this, I'm shameless, they're space elves. I specifically chose their name. Their name is based off, it's a bastardization of one of the many Old Norse names for elves. And in fact, a lot of the stuff that I use for Kalor, I haven't really gotten into it yet, but if you stick with the RP, you're going to start seeing that I work in a lot of Norse dragon terminology for the Kalorians, being based off raptors. You know, they kind of have a dragon theme going, so I'm kind of dipping into the Norse mythology a bit. But the Ansif were basically space elves who had this great civilization that destroyed itself. These relics are kind of just scattered, apparently somewhere. Kosol is this planet of myth and legend where these relics are supposed to be located. And so that's what they're looking for. They're looking for Kosol. They want to find Kosol because Kosol is said to be the last resting place of the Ansif weaponry that they're after.
If you hadn't noticed, given the intensity at which I'm asking some of these questions, I've been really hooked by your opening posts on this roleplay, and I'm totally looking to get involved myself. So you can pretty much count on me sticking around.
Fantastic. So yeah, the only thing that you or anyone else would need to know if you wanted to jump in, Ansif, basically space elves, had a great civilization that destroyed itself. Kosol is where their most powerful weapons are said to be located, and everyone's sort of looking for Kosol.
One thing I noticed in the thread is that the thread itself hasn't actually seen too much activity, despite having been around since like December of last year. And it looks like you're trying to restart it. So is this level of activity normal, or would you really hope for, a lot more activity going forward?
This kind of goes back to Inaius as a whole. And you mentioned that if you just look at the thread, if you just look at the history of Inaius, if you scroll back through the non-Eras RP section and look at all the threads tagged Inaius, it's been around for 2 years. It's been around almost as long as Strangereal has. And so you'd think it would be chock full of stories, and it kind of isn't. And most of the threads, not all, but most of the Inaius threads are world-building threads still. Now, again, that's starting to change. But that is because when Inaius was conceived, it was a side project conceived by a bunch of Eras RPers. And I wasn't even one of the first people in on it. Andy, Yuki, Aurelia, Cyrixia, Darkania, they were kind of the ones who were really gung-ho about Inaius. And they decided that, they were going to start this community, they were going to make a go of it. And then I actually kind of came along after hearing about it for a few weeks. I thought, that actually could be interesting. I think I have some ideas that could be fun. So I joined, but because it was always a side project, it sadly fell by the wayside. That's the way it goes sometimes in RP communities. I'd say that broadly, most people in TNP who RP are probably either Eras RPers or Strangereal RPers first and foremost. And a lot of the stuff, like Acheron, like Thel, like Inaius, it's all stuff we really are excited about, but sometimes we just don't have the time to commit to it. And I am sad to say that, Starfall experienced a period of lull. but Inaius as a whole experienced a period of lull. And I'm very happy to see that it has gotten back on track. I've made 2 posts in the last 48 hours, which far exceeds my output from before, but we are definitely hoping that this gains traction. It seems that it's gained traction. Inaius used to have its own Discord server. We've brought that into the TNP RP server. We've completely integrated Inaius into the Discord ecosystem that contains Eras and Strangereal. And we really hope that's going to keep it in the forefront of people's minds, because not to say that this was encouraged, but, it's very easy to ignore a Discord server if you just decide you have other things that you want to focus on. But now, Inaius is front and center. It's sharing space with Strangereal and Eras, the same people who are RPing in Strangereal and Eras and who have Inaius content are seeing Inaius daily now on the Discord server. They're getting involved. And so I am very optimistic in saying that the lull in activity you saw from April of this past year to just 2 days ago, as of this recording, that's probably not going to be as severe going forward. I sincerely hope that it's going to be kept up. I intend to keep it up, and I hope that others do as well.
Hopefully this podcast helps encourage new people to come in and get interested in it as well.
Oh, absolutely. Keoki, one of the more prolific Strangereal RPers, has just gotten involved, and I think that's fantastic. So I definitely want to see more people get involved, because I think that, if we have more people who aren't necessarily from Eris get involved, it'll help give Inaius its own character.
Yeah, so when I looked back at the large number of threads of Inaius going back, 2 years or so, I actually thought it was a really active community and that I'd just been missing out on it all along. And given that it's actually not, and you're trying to get things started again, it seems to me that this podcast really couldn't come at a better time.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. The decision to bring the Inaius community from its own Discord server into the official TNPRP server was a stroke of genius, and I cannot give both Mad Jack and Andy enough props for their mutual decision to make that happen, because not only did it bring it back into the minds of a lot of people who had sort of let it linger, it also got new people involved. As an example, I mentioned Tim, his, race of fish people. He had no idea what Inaius was. He was a new Eris RPer. He's been a new active Eris RPer, but he didn't know what Inaius was because, nobody was really talking about it. But then we brought Inaius over, and he saw it, and he got intrigued by it, and then, he joked about maybe I should do fish people, and I kind of joked about crab people, and he said, I'm going to run with that, and now he's sort of helped revitalize it. So this show that we're doing right now is coming along at a great time. It's following off the heels of a great decision to bring Inaius into the RP server, and I really hope that all of these factors have people really excited to RP in it, because Inaius is a lot of fun, and I have a lot of fun world building and RPing within it.
All right, well, I'm going to shift gears now to closing thoughts. Aside from what you said earlier and the advice you gave about building nations and world building and getting into Inaius, do you have any other advice for people looking to get started in this roleplay?
I would say the best thing to do is to not let yourself be limited. We have a great opportunity here. And again, when I said at the beginning of the show that Eras and Strangereal had limitations, I don't mean that in a negative way. Both Eras and Strangereal are meant to be geopolitical in nature. They're meant to have those restrictions. That's part of the settings that both of those worlds exist in. But Inaius allows a lot of the shackles to come off. So the best piece of advice I'd give to anyone who wants to get involved in Inaius is don't feel like you need to limit yourself. As corny as it sounds, it's as creative as your imagination will let it be. Have you been thinking about science fiction for a while? Is there an alien race that you've worked into other writings in the past that you want to flesh out? Did you just have a spur of the moment idea? But whatever it is, don't let yourself be tied down to convention. Inaius is still very young in terms of content. It's still very young in terms of a community, and the setting allows you a tremendous amount of freedom. So take advantage of it. That's one of the great things actually about it, is that it is on the forum, and so it does follow Eris's rules regarding collaboration, which is to say that if you create a star empire and you want to go to war with my Calorian empire, we need to collaborate on that. We need to talk it out. We need to decide on an outcome, and then we're going to RP it out. It's not a competitive thing. It's a collaborative thing. And I think this really plays into the freedom that Inaius offers, because you don't have to worry about restraining yourself. If you have an idea, even if you think it's out there, even if you think it's a bit overpowered, run with it. See what the community thinks, maybe make some adjustments as needed, but stay true to what you want to do, run with your idea, and if you have a story in mind that you want to tell with someone else, then it's not going to matter if you're a bit overpowered, because at the end of the day, it's all going to be about collaboration, not competition.
That collaborative viewpoint on roleplay is something that is actually what I think makes and sets RP communities here in TNP a little bit apart, and also is really important to emphasize in this podcast, because this is one that I'm going to share through the Ministry of Radio, even to people who maybe don't have as much experience role-playing. And I don't want to ruin the experience for the role players who are so invested in Inaius already. So that collaborative focus is something to, take note of. And if you're going to be joining the Inaius roleplay, keep that in mind when you're making posts that are involving other players.
As an example, like I mentioned, we have an RPer in Inaius. His species has a Death Star-like weapon. You might think that's overpowered hacks. In some ways, maybe it is, but it's not a problem, because if he and I ever decide to tell a story together, it's not like he can say, I have the Death Star, I wins. That's not going to be how it is. We're going to talk to each other, we're going to come up with a story, and we're going to tell the story. And that's great, because it allows people to do whatever they'd like, and it allows people to engage in their imaginations and not have to worry about holding themselves back.
While still telling a great story.
Exactly.
All right, and so for people who haven't role-played before and who are really just getting into things and are just hearing about this, are there any resources for people who don't have the same experience writing lengthy posts or have that, creative imagination that role players practice so frequently? Is there something out there that exists in the roleplay community so that these players can get the help they need, or is it something that's just learned by experience?
Honestly, writing, like anything else, is a matter of experience. It's a matter of repetition. The best advice I can give is just write. And this is a problem that affects every person who just starts writing. Everyone suffers from this, and I understand that it can be a bit debilitating, but best advice I can give is don't worry if it sucks or not. Don't worry about it. Just start writing. You look at the blank page. If you want to start an RP, or if you want to jump into an RP in progress, just look at the blank page and type out whatever you want to type out. Type out what's on your mind. Type out your ideas. And then once you've gotten all of that on the page, then you go back and you clean it up a bit and you futz with it here and there. But the biggest challenge for an RPer just starting out is getting words on the page. So many people are hesitant because they're so self-conscious about it. And the best thing that they can do is to just get the words on the page, and then hell or high water, good or bad, run that up the flagpole. And the thing about it is, I've been RPing in TNP since 2017. In that time, in the 2-year time between then and now, people that I've RP'd with in Eris, for example, I notice are so much more confident and mature as writers now than they were back then. And that's just in a 2-year difference. And the reason why they have improved over that time period is because they weren't afraid to put some of that stuff down. You go back to 2017, and a lot of people who you would say are quite good now, their writing was choppy. It wasn't that great back then, but they kept doing it. They were in an environment that didn't chastise them for their mistakes. It encouraged them. It encouraged their ideas. and they just kept at it, and over time they got better. They found their groove as writers. So the best thing I can say to anyone who is just starting out, who wants to get involved in RP, just put your ideas on the page. Get it down, hit post, and I promise you, we are in a community that will work with you, that will be encouraging, that people will want to know what works, people will give you feedback on what doesn't work, and the more that you post, the more that you just put your ideas down on the page, the better you're gonna get.
That's really inspiring. Thanks for saying that.
Oh yeah, no worries.
So I guess one last thing. This is nothing to do with Inaius, but it is to do with other non-Eras or non-SR worlds. And without going into too much detail, without really spending a lot of time talking about this, because I can be very confident in telling you we're going to run similar type shows for those worlds as well. But I noticed there was another world called Thel. Is that the only one?
There are two others in addition to Inaius on the forum. Most of the forum RP is Eras. There is a non-Eras section. In that non-Eras section, you've got Inaius, you've got Thel, and you've got Acheron.
Without going into too much detail, could you summarize sort of the basic setting of what those two worlds are and where they sort of are in role-playing so that someone who's interested could find the resources that they want and look into that into more detail?
Oh, yeah. So Acheron is probably going to be the closest to what you'd find in Eras or Strangereal. Acheron is actually set on our Earth. It's post-apocalyptic. And it's run by Espalandia, and you've got a map of Earth, and it's divided up into like kind of subsections, and you are allowed a certain number of sections, and you pick those sections out on the map, and that's your nation, and it's all about RPing in a post-apocalyptic world. The end has come, and society is building itself back up from the ashes. That's Acheron. Thel is Magac's brainchild, St. George. That is a fantasy setting. So you're talking your basic Tolkien, elves, orcs, dwarves. We've got a race of mushroom people in that one. Thel is fantasy. So those would be the two major ones, aside from Inaius.
All right. And then at this point, I think we'll probably be wrapping up the show. Do you have anything left to add to what's been said so far?
All I will say is that the Calorian thing that I've been working on in Inaius, the hiatus side, which we addressed, it's something I'm very excited on. I'm very happy that Inaius is starting to see traction again. I'm very happy to have contributed in my own small way to that. And I am very excited about how Starfall develops. So if anyone listening is interested in it, if anyone is listening who wants to get involved in it, I would really appreciate if you follow the thread, or if you even got involved in the thread, because it's something that's very near and dear to my heart, so the more the merrier.
So yeah, just to clarify, in order to find Inaius, all you got to do is go to the non-Eras section of the forums under the roleplay section, and that's also where you can find Thel and what was the third one? Astragon, did you say?
Acheron.
All right. Thanks so much for your time, Prydania. I know it's been about an hour and a half, which is way longer than I thought it would take, but I think this is a really good portrait of what Inaius is, and we'll go forward and hopefully expand this series in the future.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me, Fiji.
All right, have a nice evening.